It's a great pleasure to introduce this next session, and before I do, let me emphasize that this next session is going to be an exercise. First, we're going to be hearing three presentations that are going to morph then into an exercise that's going to be participatory. We're going to break into groups. We have a very ambitious schedule throughout these 2 days, and so the most important thing is to stay on schedule and to try to catch up a little bit. So when we go through this process, we hope that you'll cooperate with us in keeping on time as much as possible. But in any event, it's an honor to introduce this session. Our two speakers go without, need no introduction, but it's Ron Kagan and Scott Carter, who have been, for the last 3 decades, just leading us so gently and skillfully on this path towards an improvement in zoo animal welfare. And so, Ron, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So we know and we want you to be able to interact a lot with each other. And we'll be able to do that this evening with alcohol added to the mix. So, but actually for the next hour and a half or so, we really need everybody fully engaged, because you're going to be hamsters, guinea pigs, whatever you want to identify with, because we're rolling out the framework. And this is something that actually has been in the making for a long time. It is not, I don't know, I'm literally this part of making up as I go along. It's not that we're trying to create a fully fleshed human. We think we've created a skeleton and a basic neural infrastructure and various other things, but we need to make sure that things are proportional and things are appropriate and that they're facing the right way, etc. There are some philosophical pieces to this, some of which will be potentially disconcerting to people, and for others will not be ambitious enough. For some it may be they may be viewed as real obstacles, and for others very exciting opportunities. So we're not assuming that we're going to have 100% consensus, but what we are trying to do is move this forward, because the reality is animal welfare has been slow to progress in the zoo world. It's been bogged down in a lot of different things, not unlike many other things in life, sometimes politics, sometimes egos, cultural differences. There are lots of reasons, lots of excuses. For a while, the excuse was, well, we don't have the science, and we can't move without the science. And I think that's something which we basically think is ridiculous. We couldn't be more committed to the science, but we think it's ridiculous to not use common sense and use our basic understanding of animals and nature, and not use that as an excuse to stall or to go slowly. We hosted an AZA conference here in 2001. That's 13 years ago. And it was called Animal Welfare 911, because it was our view and many others. At that time, we had the head of the Humane Society of the United States, a number of others from the animal welfare community. We felt like there was a real emergency within the zoo world, but a lack of understanding of animal welfare, a lack of action to dramatically enhance it and commit to it. So this has been a very long process, an iterative process, which is the way things should be, an evolutionary process. And what we'd like to do today is share with you our suggestion of how to move forward. So it comes in 3 sections. The first is institutional philosophy and policy. In other words, what are we committed to? What are our values? Then we're going to talk about programmatic structure and resources. In other words, how would we take the philosophy or those policies, and how would we then create a platform that a zoo, and by the way, when I say zoo, I mean aquarium as well, that a zoo or an aquarium could create the infrastructure. So here, for instance, we created the Center for Zoo Animal Welfare. We had no idea how else to do it. That doesn't mean this is the only way to do it, because it clearly isn't. But we think that's part two, taking the philosophy and the institutional philosophy and policy, creating structure and resources for it, and then ultimately the execution and the evaluation. So there's a lot of theory. We're really obsessive about applying stuff, and so we felt that we had to carry this from the beginning to the end. And we have now used this system over the past year. Whether it's fair or not fair, we used it on the Chinese and evaluated the 3 largest zoos in China. We also have done it on ourselves. But this is, again, this is iterative. There are derivatives of this, which or precursors to this, which have been used for years in various programs that we have done. So let's quickly, I'm going to very quickly go through institutional philosophy and policy, and then Scott Carter, our Chief Life Sciences Officer and co-conspirator, along with Stephanie, and before Stephanie, Cynthia Bennett. Scott's going to go through the programmatic resources and execution and evaluation. At AZA this year, there was a number of great discussions and sessions. A number of people here were in parts of those. I'm very excited that you're going to contribute to this because we heard some exciting things. But first of all, historically, zoos have kind of been committed to the notion of conservation and have defined conservation in a fairly conservative way. We're going to hear a lot about compassionate conservation later on, but we think that this has to be a commitment not just to conservation, meaning species welfare, but to individual welfare. You have to make that commitment. If you don't, you ultimately will make all sorts of decisions which are going to compromise individual animals. We have to understand, and this is something that's not well understood, that animal care is not animal welfare. Now, there was a little bit of discussion earlier this morning. To be provocative, you can put a man and a woman in a prison and they can live to be 100 years. That does not mean they have good well-being. And we'll talk about why not in a second. But animal care is about provisioning. It is not about whether an animal is happy or not, whether its well-being is good. We obviously feel there has to be a foundation of science, but also compassion and common sense. And the common sense, you know, I don't mean to poke anybody, and there's nobody in the room I'm poking, but, you know, all of this discussion for decades now about elephants in zoos, is it possible to do it in a way that an elephant probably has a good quality of life? Yes, it's possible. But we all know so many elephants have suffered, and yet we've said, no, we have to document this with massive studies in order for it to be proven. I mean, it's silly. We know there are big issues and they require urgent action. Policies that demonstrate the commitment for each individual animal, and we believe from cradle to grave. So again, these are some of the policy things which not all institutions will agree to. We know in Europe, you know, healthy giraffe euthanized. We think if we created the giraffe, it's our responsibility. Commitment, and this is so unbelievably important. So if you take the issue that the commitment has to be to the individual animal, the other commitment that is so pivotal is this issue of choice and control. And again, I'm not worried about being called anthropomorphic because I know that I am a you know, I'm no different than a non-human animal. I am an animal, okay? I know that if I'm deprived of choice and control, I am fundamentally frustrated, certainly psychologically, if not physically. That always causes problems, sometimes really severe ones, sometimes not so severe. But if we don't give meaningful choice and control, And this is very difficult because, no, we're not letting the animals leave, so they don't have that choice. We also don't have full choice and control. So we're not talking about giving animals complete control and choice. Nobody has that. We all have compromises. The issue is, can we cope with them? Is there enough in it? So I'm almost finished. Next one is institutionally, there has to be a commitment to capacity building. Scott is going to go through all these in terms of how they get translated into structure and execution. But capacity building and resource allocation for animal welfare, we spend, I don't even know how much we spend every year, very clearly, specifically on animal welfare. And a commitment to educating all of the staff in animal welfare, and you'll see that that happens in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and I'm going to come back at the end and then show you the exercise we want you to do with us.
Thanks, Ron. Programmatically, programs is where our policy and our commitment hits the road. So programmatically, it has to start with dedication of our resources, including our staff resources, to animal welfare. And that's the creation of positions dedicated to animal welfare, even though responsibility for animal welfare is broad and lies with a number of, certainly all positions in animal care in our view, and certainly a number of other positions. But there needs to be, for real programmatic strength, there needs to be positions dedicated to animal welfare, including animal welfare scientists. We think this warrants dedication of position at the same level that we do for many of us. There's a director of conservation, a director of animal health, a director of, in some zoos, a director of animal care, a director of animal welfare, which is what we have committed to here, which drives and makes sure that what we're doing is completely integrated. There needs to be a comprehensive animal welfare approach to how we design animal environments and how we design the care programs and the operations that are required. And this includes especially the behind the scenes. Several papers today talked about differences between the resources we allocate to animals that people can see and the resources we allocate to spaces that people can't see. And especially the Okapi paper talked about the real impact that has on animals because of the time they have to spend there. That's one. I'm sorry, I have to keep going back and forth to when I need glasses and when I don't. It's also important, this, part of this also, when we speak programmatically, is having our processes in place for design of habitats and design that includes all the right players at the table. It should include our leaders in animal welfare, our staff in animal welfare, in addition to our staff in animal health, animal care. For many habitats, we need to include people in education. It's not just the animal staff. And then it's when we design our animal care practices, making sure that our practices, we have the processes in place to make sure that our practices have a really significant welfare approach so that we are sensitive to how animals are impacted by what we do, by what we have to do to take care of them and manage their habitats. Making sure that our practices are sensitive to every individual animal's sensory ecology. The regimes we put in place to clean their habitats, the chemicals that we use to clean their habitats, the schedules that we use, all of these things have to be part of a comprehensive and integrated program. We need to have our programs that significantly address the needs of an animal across its 24-hour day. Again, we've had some great papers today that have focused on this, that animals have 24-hour lives. And much of what we do programmatically is based on the 10 or 12 hours that we are here working. In some occasions, this was brought up in several of the papers. This is also affected by the times and the periods in which we can actually see animals. This is one of the things that we tend to fall back on zoos is we talk a lot about our enrichment programs. We have enrichment programs, but we recognize them for what they are, which is compensatory strategies that attempt to make up for what our captive environments aren't providing. We think that this gets a little provocative, but we think that rather than heralding our enrichment programs to the world, we should be perhaps a little more circumspect in talking about the things that we know we're not providing for animals. Certainly enrichment, providing environments that meet animals' needs, those environments should be enriched appropriately for the species. So we have to have enrichment, but it goes far beyond the food and toy type based enrichments that seem to be the foundation for much of what we're doing and calling enrichment. And again, what we do for enrichment, for enriching environments, has to go beyond an 8.5-hour day that our staff is here. The animals' 24-hour lives certainly require a lot more in their environments after we go home. It has to include, obviously, to be a little more specific, it has to include the animals' schedules and their temporal patterns and our schedules as well. Programmatically, we should have a comprehensive program that considers animal welfare in our population planning and the decisions we make for the species that we choose to have, which is where it all starts. And these, how animal welfare is impacted, obviously considers the things that is our climate right? Do we have enough space? Do we have enough resources? Does this species choice require so many resources that it impacts other species that we already have? These are all the kinds of decisions in population planning that consider the well-being of the individual animals that we will end up acquiring. We also have to consider, we think it's important that a comprehensive program that considers individual animal welfare in our population planning has to allow for the inclusion of animals that we weren't planning. For us, it's the rescue of exotic animals in bad situations. For us, it's important that our population planning consider our flexibility to be able to commit resources to unplanned events like that. Unplanned animals, I should say. Formal and ongoing animal welfare training for staff. This is something that, for us, I'll keep going back and forth between what we do and what we think people should do, and in some cases is what we think we should do because we're not 100% there in all of these. But for us, this is training that starts with new hire orientation, and it goes through professional development across all of the staff. And that's training in animal welfare. It's different levels of training. The people we have working in landscape and the people we have, the volunteers, the people who work in administration don't need to have the level and the understanding of animal welfare that our animal care staff do, certainly. So it's development of a multi-layered training program to provide the right training in animal welfare for everyone in the organization. Everyone in our organization should understand the importance of animal welfare and what animal welfare is. I just lost an entire page. Stephanie, help. We have an animal welfare concern reporting process, as all AZA institutions do. And this, it's okay, I had a funny little ghost slide for some reason. We're all required to have an animal welfare concern reporting process for our staff. We have a process that includes our volunteers and a process that includes taking input from our guests as well. With respect to our staff and our volunteers, this is a part of having our staff and volunteers trained in animal welfare and understanding what they're seeing. When anyone has questions, and this is true this is part of the structure of the animal welfare reporting process for AZA zoos, for those of you who are not in zoos. This is a process by which anyone can ask a question that they have about an animal they see at the zoo, and they can get a response to their question. Some of these responses require investigation, it requires some work, but every question gets a response, and we have a process that ensures that that happens when somebody has a question. We've extended this to our guests as well, and many institutions might have as well, which has to be managed a little differently, but we still want to be able to answer people's questions. We think it's important that our guests, as well as our staff, understand our commitment to animal welfare. The acquisition, transfer, and transition policy that all AZA zoos have also needs to reflect a commitment to the individual animal's lifelong welfare. as well as the population considerations. We're all taking part in cooperative cooperative management programs, I should say, for those of you who are not in zoos. There's a very well-planned and organized, very fairly complex process going on in AZA-accredited zoos that manages each of these different species populations with the goal of maintaining it for a long period of time. For some species, 100 or 200 years. This requires careful management of the genetic composition of the population and careful management of its demography so that it can be sustainable over the long term. In AZA zoos, we've all committed to being a part of these programs. The decisions that we make to acquire animals, to breed certain animals, are all part of these cooperative programs in most cases. But this, and the, as part of our acquisition and transfer, and then transitioning animals out of here, that's the transition part of that policy, we have to consider not just what the population needs, which is obviously important, we have to consider the impacts on the individual animals we're transitioning. And many times in zoos, our plans change over time as we build new exhibits, as our priorities change, as we respond to emerging needs. An example for us was amphibians about more than 12 years ago now. Responding to a growing crisis among wild amphibians, we dedicated resources and a facility to amphibians. That required changing some other priorities at that time. But many times when that happens, I have to put my glasses on to read the signal from Stephanie. Am I about done? I have to go faster, okay. I don't want to be the one who makes us late. But the point of this, I want to finish this point because it's an important one. When our plans change, sometimes animals are left hanging. We have animals for which we no longer have a plan. We have to recognize, and our policy recognizes that we have a commitment to those individual animals just because they're no longer needed in a breeding program or no longer part of our plans. We still have to maintain our responsibility and our obligation. Still going faster, Ron. And this is fine. This is the last point. Programmatically, it's important that we have a compassionate conservation program that ensures that both in our in situ and our ex situ programs, we're being consistent with our commitment to animal welfare. Stephanie talked about compassionate conservation this morning. I'm now going to talk really fast. So I'm not going to define compassionate conservation, but for us, it's an important programmatic piece that we are consistent in both our in situ and ex situ programs. Okay.
Thank you, Scott. There's also an execution and evaluation piece, which apparently I'm doing. So this is going granular, and I'm really going to take 1 minute to do all of this. But this is taking all of the things that Scott and I shared and being very specific about how does that play out actually in daily operations, in our care, in our facility design. So for instance, we think you should have animal welfare staff anytime you're designing any kind of exhibit, not just animal care staff. The same thing in terms of the social environment. It just does not get enough attention. The well-being of anybody is enormously impacted by the physical environment and by the social and psychological environment. So there needs to be so much attention to this, and there generally isn't. We've already talked about this kind of science doesn't negate the need for compassion and for common sense. Tons and tons of evaluation and looking at outcomes, but again, not using that as the the paralysis of analysis. So we still need to keep moving forward as best we can. There's a feedback system, and that's part of what's going to be happening with our exercise, so that we make adjustments along the way, and we don't need to wait years to do research and then make the adjustments. He explained the reporting process, the training program, and we do want to emphasize, we literally, at every all-employee meeting, we talk about green, we talk about animal welfare, we talk about safety, we make sure that this is a core piece. And that the outcomes for conservation really don't become blind to individuals. And again, at the expense of being a little bit provocative, we're all rejoicing about saving black-footed ferrets, except guess what? The prairie dogs out there are not so happy. So the reality is we're picking winners and choosers. That may be okay in terms of our moral grounding. It may not be, but we do need to pay attention because the impact of everything we do tends to have positive impact on some things and negative on others. Okay, this is the eye test. Anybody read it? No? Okay. You're going to break up into groups of about 10 people. So we think there are going to be 7 groups. And we're going to do this in about 2 or 3 minutes after I explain this. And then we're going to ask you to spend half an hour talking among yourselves. We need one person in each group to volunteer to be the representative of the group so that when we come back together, we're going to call on you. And you're going to have 3 minutes to share with the group the main things that work for you and the main things that don't. Now, again, I realize you can't read this. I'm going to explain this in a moment, but I want to explain the process. 4 of the groups are going to stay in this room, and then 3 to 4 other groups are going to be directed by a staff member to another area, the leaf room and the studios and things like that. You will have what you see behind me. You'll have hard copies of this, and there are 2 documents. So the first document, which is up here, is evaluating the institutional commitment and philosophy and policies. Now, I'm not implying anything, but when I was in China doing this for the 3 biggest zoos in China, I would ask questions like this. This has been revised since then, and the answers were always yes, of course. Not so simple to get, it's kind of a little bit like accreditation. Show me. Because showing me a document in Chinese, I obviously couldn't do anything with. So this only works in America at the moment, possibly in England, although they spell funny. But in any event, you'll see there are questions here like, and this is subjective, but it gets more objective. Does it appear that there is a clear commitment to animal welfare at the executive and management levels? Are there written and comprehensive policies with respect to animal welfare? Are there official welfare positions designated to the oversight of animal welfare? If yes, please list their names and titles. Is there specific training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this starts going from the overall stuff, and it gets more and more granular. So there's one document, I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 pages, that talks about the commitment and policies and resources. And then there's this document, which is multiple pages. And this is animal environment evaluation, animal environment meaning habitat or exhibit. And this is where somebody goes out and either looks at an individual animal or an individual exhibit, or in some cases both, and goes through a whole series of questions like, does it appear that the physical environment is appropriate in terms of basic provisions? Okay, so this is kind of about care, like food, water, shelter, size, complexity, construction, landscape design. For instance, is the ratio of land to water appropriate? Can flighted bird species fly? Things like that. Can animals which spend their lives digging for a living, like anteaters or aardvarks, are they on a concrete floor? These are all things which we know potentially, if not definitely, compromise animal welfare. So 4B is are any animals kept in alternative areas for a substantial portion of each 24-hour period? Again, getting back to some of these basic tenets. Does each animal have the ability to choose where and with whom they spend their time? There are some very tough questions here. And you heard early this morning the distinction between formats that use scores versus non-scores, we very intentionally did not do a score. We don't have this as a numerical scoring system. The Chinese really wanted that. And we felt that it was very problematic to do that. But what we want you to do is go into the groups. We want you to quickly, I mean, we just really have to be very disciplined about this because of the time. We want you to quickly agree on what exhibit and or what animal you want to pick. So somebody, you know, not everyone comes from a zoo, but quickly talk about it, decide what you want to do. You can pick anything you want, and we like it when there's a variety. I used to do this in a different format at Michigan State University, and it was really illuminating when we picked different species and animals. And then we want you to go through this on both documents, and we want you to come back and we want you to tell us, I mean, you can tell us if you'd like that you just don't like the fundamental philosophy piece. And if you don't, then it's going to be hard to go through this because you're not, you know, you're not accepting the basic premise. And by all means, share that. But what we want you to do is especially on the second piece, really think about, okay, if I was looking at the seal exhibit at the zoo in Baltimore, I know no one is here, I don't even know if they have a seal exhibit in Baltimore, would this work? Are these the right questions to ask? Are there things that are missing? Are there things that are completely out of whack? And then you'll come back and you'll tell us. And we'll see whether we can refine this, whether we can enhance it, where the big challenges are to it.